Hello and welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. I'm Tony,
I'm Patrick.
and we are working our way through J.P. Moreland's book, Scientism and Secularism, Learning to Respond to a Dangerous Ideology. And we have made our way to chapter 10. We hope perhaps we'll do 10 and 11 on this particular notion. We've about midway through chapter 10. And he's been talking to us in this chapter about examples of the authority and autonomy thesis of philosophy. And we spent the first half of this chapter, he did, explaining the authority thesis. And now this last portion of the chapter, he's going to touch on some examples of the autonomy thesis, right? So autonomy means that philosophy can stand on its own. Authority means that it has authority. It has a right to say what it says, right? It isn't dependent on science and that sort of. All right. So what are some examples of the autonomy thesis with regard to philosophy? Well, he starts off with the nature and existence of consciousness and the soul as an example to show the autonomy thesis. He says these are the sorts of questions that form the warp and woof of science, of the philosophy of mind. So what are these questions? Well, they're ontological questions like, to what is a mental or physical property identical? There are epistemological questions like, how do we come to have knowledge or justified beliefs about other minds and about our own minds? There are semantic questions like, what is a linguistic entity and how is it related to meaning? There are methodological questions like, how should one proceed in analyzing and resolving the first order issues that constitute the philosophy of mind? And so notice he says it is evident that these are in no way scientific questions. They are philosophical to the core, and he suggests they nicely illustrate the autonomy of philosophy thesis, right? Philosophy asks these questions, not necessarily science, right? And so these are philosophical questions. And so philosophy can stand on its own. So this is an example of the autonomy thesis.
Yeah. So, we've done, at this point, probably millions of brain surgeries. We've developed the tools to go in and root around in people's brains. And lo and behold, we haven't found any minds yet. Found brains, but we haven't found minds. So sometimes we're not quite sure the brains are there until we crack open the skull. So
maybe all those people are just out of their minds, or maybe their minds are out.
So, if we can't find the mind, well, do we just say it doesn't exist? Well, it seems odd that, the personality traits, the ability to hold, memories and the things that make you just boil down to the chemical reactions, the electricity in your brain firing up at certain times. And then, you go to sleep, you wake up and you're a completely different person that way, right?
Actually, moment by moment, you're a different person. Right?
Exactly. So, if science cannot tell us these things, and science is the only tool in our toolbox, well, are we just out of luck? But these questions are going to pop up. In fact, they've popped up since, the Greek times. So, we've been asking these questions for a while. And if we hang all our hats on the science tool, we won't be able to get close to this type of answer or even within the realm of the question. All right, so how about methodological naturalism, agent causation, and the nature of science? That's the second one. Well, when it comes to the task of defining or giving the essential characteristics of science, that task belongs to the philosophers and the historians of science, and not to the scientists themselves. Perhaps the main philosophical issue is in the theistic evolution intelligence design dialogue involves the relationship between science and the appropriateness of using science to warrant the inference to intelligent cause for some phenomena. Central to this dialogue is the question of whether or not science must adopt methodological naturalism, roughly the idea that doing science, one must seek only the natural causes explanation for the scientific data. So that's one, is the imposition that, whatever you're doing, you must assume that there's only such things as the natural world and nothing outside of it. So you can't bring in non-physical entities into the equation to offer explanatory powers or answers. And so, while that might be all fine, well and good, but what if there are things outside of the natural world that do interact with the physical? So again, our minds seem to have some way to interact with the natural, and devoiding ourselves of that answer seems to only hurt our understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to wake up, what it means to mess around with people's identities. And so all these things seem more than natural world. But that is one possibility, and it does seem to be what the majority of scientists do, at the very least, to make their lives more simple there.
So what he's going to talk about here, notice, is causality and causation, right? And when we talk about causes, methodological naturalism says if we're going to do it scientifically, we only can explain or have causes that are natural, right? So that means we can't have personal causes, or causality is what it's often referred to. And of course, obviously, he's going to take issue with that, as we would expect he would. He says there's been some controversy as to which field that is the proper place to turn to in order to seek professional expertise in resolving this debate with regard to theistic evolution, intelligent design, and the notion of methodological naturalism. He says, nor is the question of professional expertise merely in an academic matter of turf protection, because currently it is largely scientists and science educators who are the gatekeepers for the public schools in this area, right? So they call the shots, they say what gets in and what gets out. And he says, actually, the issue here is not controversial at all, even though, it's a controversy. He says the issue really isn't controversial, since the central topics do not involve how to practice science, which requires familiarity with instrumentalization and procedures and that kind of stuff, right? But the central topics involve how to define science and distinguish it from non-science or pseudoscience. That's the issue. And those, again, he's going to argue here, are not determined by scientific methods, right?
Right. Again, we can't titrate it. We can't break it apart to its different elements. This tends to be a philosophical one.
Right. How do we know that this particular notion or set of procedures or whatever is non-scientific and this one is scientific, right? How do we know why do we say astrology is a pseudoscience and astronomy is real science? How do we make a distinction between those? Where does that come from? Well, those aren't scientific questions. Those are philosophical questions, is what he's getting at here.
Right. Well, to understand this debate and the proper field of study for resolving it, we must first make a distinction between first and second order issues. A first order issue is a topic of science about some phenomenon, e.g. how to predict earthquakes or manipulate chemical reaction rates. And the second order issues is the topic of philosophy about science itself, such as its methods, its nature, its differences from other fields. So those are the two. The first tends to be kind of what you think of when you think of doing science experiments, right?
Yeah.
Like doing the science is there. But the second order is there for when you're talking about the more higher level concepts of, what does it mean to have a nature and stuff like that.
Right. So it's the doing science versus talking about doing science. Right. That's the second one. Yeah.
So now the question of how to define science is clearly a topic for philosophers and historians of science. This is not to say that scientists and others cannot be a part of this discussion. In fact, it would be probably wrong of us to not include scientists into the history of science. It's merely to affirm that when they participate, they will largely be dealing with philosophical issues, which they are not professionally trained in.
Yeah. Good. And so what have we come to here with regard to this chapter? Well, he says in his conclusion that in this chapter we have seen that other branches of inquiry besides science, in particular philosophy, provide knowledge of reality that's either completely independent of scientific discoveries, like the authority thesis, or more authoritative than science, right? Actually, that is the authoritative thesis. So the first one is the autonomy thesis. He says two things of great importance for Christians follow from these theses. First, philosophy has always been considered a handmaiden, a servant of theology. And so when the theologians and biblical scholars work with philosophers to make a carefully presented and defended thesis about the world, we should, he says, not automatically accept the scientific claim and revise the Bible to harmonize with the latest science. Notice, where is he getting that from? Well, because philosophy and therefore theology have authority and are autonomous in their own light. That's where he's getting that from. And so they don't automatically have to fold for science when they make claims about the world and the reality of what's going on in the world. So that's the first thing. Rather, he shows that this chapter demonstrates that we often have more rational evidence and authority for the carefully developed theological claims than science do for their conflicting claim, right? So that's the notion here that he wants us to see. The authority and autonomy of philosophy gives Christians also a notion of authority and autonomy just from the logical argument, because they are considered the handmaiden, right? And so theology is, and so therefore, it's philosophy. Since philosophy does this, then the theology does it as well.
We can be the bride sometimes. It's never always being the bridesmaid. But that's right. So if a conflict arises between current scientific assertions and traditional interpretation of the Bible, we should take a deep breath and give our evangelical or other scholars time to address this issue, all the while having confidence that it is likely that traditional interpretations of Scripture, if it's carefully done, will eventually win the debate. So we stay the course, admit that as of now there is a conflict, and remain confident that we have good reasons to not revise our views. Again, just put yourself back, 50 years, 75 years, the idea of the universe being a solid state universe. And this is what all scientists agreed upon. This was the thing that the majority of scientists did. And so if you want to consistently be following and playing catch up to the latest scientific claims, then you're going to say, oh, well, the Bible gives us all these assumptions that the universe is the solid state that God has created in such a way that makes us be able to agree with our fellow scientists. Well, and then background radiation happens, and then the Big Bang model comes out. And again, you don't have to just latch on to the Big Bang model, but if you're then going to then have to play catch up with what now the majority of scientists believe in, well, then you're going to go back through and you're going to be, fanning through Scripture and trying to find that point rather than allowing the Scripture to speak to what the claim is. And so you don't always have to be playing catch up to science. Scientists sometimes need to be catching up to where the philosophy and theology is.
So stay the course.
That's right. Take a breath. It's fine. Just remember that they wanted to drill holes into people's heads long before they actually wanted to help people to root around in their brains or all the other various things that are now, feeling bumps on your head to see if you're going to be a criminal. That was in the realm of science.
The shape of your head or the size of your head or whatever.
That's right. So, now we can laugh at phrenology, but at the time, phrenology, they had measurements, they had head models, they had studies, they had peer-reviewed studies. So
physical evidence.
Yeah. Who are we to badmouth the science? So that's just where we need to be. And again, Christians shouldn't be poo-pooing science, but we should understand the authority claims that reside in making those claims.
All right. So first, then, with regard to the authority and autonomy thesis, philosophy has just as much claim to have notions and theories of reality as science does. And we don't just automatically fold because there's a conflict, right? We need to wait and try to see how those issues are worked out. Secondly, he says methodological naturalism is the main thing that is keeping intelligent design from being taken seriously by scientists and educators. And of course, he's already said they are the gatekeepers, right, to knowledge in schools and so forth. And so sadly, scientists and educators are the gatekeepers for what cannot be taught, right, as science in the public schools and so forth. And so he says, as we have seen in this chapter, definitions of the nature of science, including arguments for and against methodological naturalism, are largely philosophical issues, not scientific questions, right? And thus philosophers, he's suggesting, should be the gatekeepers here. And the majority of philosophers of science agree that intelligent design theory or even creation science, using the Bible to formulate and test scientific models, are examples, notice, of science, even if those philosophers are atheists and don't believe that these theories are true, right? In other words, philosopher would, like Loudon, for instance, Larry Loudon says that, you don't attack them for not being science, you attack them for being false science or wrong science, is what he's suggesting. So even atheists hold that these notions are scientific theories, right? So again, we should not be bullied by scientists and educators who define science in such a way that only naturalistic explanations are allowed.
That's right. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we can take most scientists and educators, so we'll be good there.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's the end of chapter 10 there. And so now we'll move on to chapter 11, which asks the questions, well, how do we explain things? And so he starts off with chapter 11 here by saying the ability to explain things and to seek explanations is at the heart of the intellectually virtuous life, right? We view the person who is able to explain things in a positive light. There are times when that could be overly done, or we could be listening to things that we don't want to hear. But overall, we find the people in our lives who can help us and explain things to our level or have a grasp of the material. And we say that person kind of exhibits a good life, a virtuous life there. But few of us stop to consider that there are different types of explanations for various phenomena we encounter. For example, the philosophers of religion, Richard Swinburne, has made the rather obvious, though often overlooked point, that there is a great difference between a standard physical scientific explanation for some events and a personal explanation. In this short chapter, he wants to introduce our bearings regarding these two types of explanations, a scientific one and a personal one.
Right. So what's the difference here and how do they work, right? Well, let's start with standard scientific explanations because that's where he starts with. Right? He says in standard scientific explanations, a state, also called an event or a change of state, is explained. So that's what scientific explanations attempt to do. Explain an event or a state or a change of a state or an event. For example, he says we may try to explain why the pressure of a gas is in a certain state or why it changed into that state, right? And so he says we also may try to determine the reason, for instance, a tornado was formed. And he tells us that in such cases, one event causes another event in accordance with some law of nature. So there it is. There we see actually a couple of things, right? Event, and laws of nature. And so what he says is we have event causation. So now that's the basic idea of a standard scientific explanation. Now he's going to kind of expand on that to help us to understand it.
Right. So associated with event causation is a covering law model of explanation according to which some event is explained or covered by giving a valid deductive or inductive argument for that event. Such an argument utilizes two features. First, a universal or statistical law of nature, or two, some initial causal conditions. So, for example, all metal rods expand if heated is the law. Metal rod X was heated, there's the condition, and therefore metal rod X expanded. So the explanation. So, boiling water, you can do this. And then you talk about, well, the particles move at a different rate and they become less solidified to each other. And so you talk about the different states of matter there. When it comes to the law of molecules and how they exhibit different behaviors, whether cooled or heated. And so that's what the example is doing as well. So you have your law, then your condition, the thing that was done. And then the explanation is what you expect. And so it should tie to that law. So the condition should tie to the law to give you the explanation. So that's how the associated causation there happens.
Now he does mention that obviously not all scientists hold to this particular position, but This is the basic one that many hold to. It's called the covering law model. So that is standard scientific explanation. You have a law, you have conditions, initial conditions, and then you have the explanation as a result. What about personal explanations? What are they and how are they different if they are different? Well, it says standard scientific explanations are crucial, but they must stay in their lane, he tells us. They're not the only way to explain why things happen. A personal explanation of some event or state of affairs intentionally brought about by a person, divine or otherwise, will employ notions such as not laws, but intention of the agent, right? The relevant power of the agent that was exercised in causing the state of affairs. So it's not necessarily the conditions or the laws, right? But it's the intention and the power of the particular agent.
Right. So these kinds of explanations are used all the time, especially in court. In a murder trial, for example, the jury seeks personal explanations. Who committed the murder? What power did he use to do this? Did the alleged killer actually possess that power? And could he exercise it all at the right place at the right time? And what were his intentions? All, but really the last, that's the motive. You don't really need a motive for court. But all those things are things that are necessary to explain for convicting someone of murder, that they committed murder, that they did a thing. And so you don't talk about, well, objects that travel at certain meters per second interacted with a body that was not at motion, and that body fell over. And we say that they expired. So, okay, well, we found that the bullet killed the person. Good, done. We found the explanation. Moving on. Guilty. The bullet is guilty. No, we're trying to get to the intelligence behind the use of that bullet. So a personal explanation does not consist in offering an impersonal, unintentional mechanism, but rather incorrectly citing the relevant person, his or her intentions, and the basic power exercise. Well, that person doesn't have any hands. They couldn't have fired the bullet. And so we know that somebody else did, or that person at least didn't use their hands to fire the gun. A covering law model of explanation, in contrast, would be out of court, pun intended, in a jury trial. No jury wants to know the natural law and relevant formula needed to calculate why bullets are able to be discharged from a gun. Now, sometimes that is possible, but or that is done in court, but that's only done to solidify that personal explanation of where someone was standing, or could they have been from here, or was there a second shooter involved? All those things could be utilized. The covering model could be utilized, but for the state purposes of having an explanation from the personal aspect, that's not the only answer that we care about. It's not bullets go out of guns for this reason. You'll use that in your explanation, but then you'll talk about it in a greater capacity to talk about the who and the why.
Yeah. Good. All right. So what has he done so far? Well, he's asked the question, how do we explain? He says there are at least two basic ways to explain. The scientific kind of explanation that has to do with covering law model, right? And personal explanations that has to do with persons, intention, and that sort of thing. So that's, there's two kinds of ways to explain. And he's going to pursue this further in the next chapter, but now, at the end of this chapter, he wants to make one more point. He talks about the criteria for things that are scientifically inexplicable, right? Scientifically inexplicable. What are the criteria that we need to show that something cannot be explained by science? And so he says in the next chapter, he wants to look at 5 things that science cannot explain, even in principle. But before we get there, he tells us, to have criteria in place for knowing why it would be the case that science could not explain something. And of course, Richard Swinburne here identifies 2 features that do not fit into any pattern of scientific explanation. Phenomena that are, first, too odd, and phenomena that are too big. So he wants to look at these 2 things in turn.
Right. So phenomena that are too odd to fit into a pattern of scientific explanation is the first one that he covers. What would it mean for a phenomenon to be too odd to be explained by science? One, when you have to add new laws just to make sense of the event. People who have been dead for 2 to 3 days coming back to life due to prayer. Well, that's quite odd, and we'd have to come up with some explanation for that.
Yeah, so notice all the gyrations the scientists would have to go through in order to make that event into a scientific kind of explanation, right? He'd have to, invent all kinds of things in order to help try to explain that, right?
Right. Exactly.
That's so odd.
Swinburne's point is that any attempt to revise the medical theory so that its laws can now predict apparent miracles would make the theory hopelessly complex and arbitrary. So, barring the explanation of, well, it only appeared that way, but have it be the case that this is all the added extra things that would come into play here would kind of overturn our understandings.
Yeah, good. All right. So the first one, too odd to fit a pattern of scientific explanation, is when you have to add new laws just to make sense of the event. The second one is when the new phenomenon leaves us with a large number of unwieldy brute facts that cannot be explained and that make our laws or theories violate the principle of simplicity. So we have all kinds of brute facts that don't fit into what's going on. They're dangling out there that aren't part of the coherent explanation. He says that violates the law of simplicity, the principle of simplicity, and it shows, again, that, things are too odd.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of fits into this third point when you have a new phenomenon utterly unique from anything in the old theory. And the new phenomenon incorporated into the old theory is so utterly unique and different from every other entity in the theory, such that the new phenomenon's appearance cannot, in principle, have been predicted by the old theory. Then the expanded version of the old theory is false. Right. This would be the revolution, not in little bits of phenomenal aspects that we view, but this would be, giant things entering into the picture and going, wow, this is way too much for our current model. We kind of know it's wrong, but we don't have anything else to supplant it with. Well, according to Scientism, though, the entire history of the universe was a history of strictly physical entities until the very first sentient being evolved. And prior to the appearance of these beings, there were no sensations, thoughts, desires, and so forth. Some people even go even further than that and say there was no truth outside of the first formation of that knowledge being. And the appearance of the conscious was utterly unpredictable from even exhaustive godlike knowledge of brute matter. Thus, the nature of consciousness is odd, and it does not fit or is not at home in the naturalistic physical worldview. So, of course, then what you have to do is you have to expand your idea of what physicality is and what science is, or you just deny it all and say, nope, all we're dealing with is natural.
Right.
Unfortunately, it seems like the latter is what's being practiced most of the time.
So the phenomenon here is utterly unique. Consciousness arose somehow, right? Doesn't fit in with everything else that is part of the explanation of what's going on. And so this makes the theory of what's going on, this particular phenomenon of consciousness is odd, right? And so maybe we can't explain it naturalistically, physically, right? That's what he's getting at. And then finally, the fourth one here, he says, when you have phenomena contingently related to physical facts, right? So usually we look at causal relations, right, or that sort of thing. But what about contingent relations, right? In other words, this doesn't have to be part of the deal, right? He says a full, adequate scientific explanation should show why some phenomena must occur given another phenomenon. So this has to happen because of this, right? This is the cause fact necessitates that the effect fact takes place. So this causal fact causes this effect fact, right? They relate to one another. But for instance, brain states, mental states, correlations, he says, are contingent, and therefore they are odd brute facts without a scientific explanation. Why? Well, because the things they don't necessarily relate, and they don't have to relate. They're not dependent. There isn't this causal, effectal kind of relationship, right? And so in some, he says, according to Swinburne, a phenomena is scientifically inexplicable if it's, and he spelled out, these various four characteristics of this.
Right. And then phenomena that are too big to fit into a pattern of scientific explanation. Well, Swinburne's first characteristic of scientific inexplicability of some phenomenon is its oddness. His second characteristic is that the phenomenon's too big. Rather than explain the too big criteria here, our author says, let us delve into some examples of things that science cannot in principle explain. And I think that if we do this, then the too big factor will become obvious. So to that subject, we'll turn to the next chapter, which is what we'll do next time. And so that sets it up nicely for chapter 12. And we'll cover that next time. Again, all the short clips can be found for parsing out these episodes on YouTube. And you can find all our previous episodes on caveofthecross.com. So thanks for joining us. And hopefully this has been a book that is well worth it. And again, we're not conflating science with scientism, but we're trying to delve more and challenging the aspect that people almost unknowingly hold when they are unknowing scientismists. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.